I will start with that Reggie Watts song that I sent you before, entitled "If You're Effing, You're Effing." I've already broken the rule and
so so that I know also what kind of words terminology to use.
No, you can say it. You can say fucking if you want. So here are a few lines from the song, and I'll just say it. The lines are: if you're fucking, then you're probably fucking. If you're fucking, then you're probably having some sex. If you're not fucking, then you're probably not fucking. If you're not fucking, then you definitely ain't fucking. If you're not fucking, then you most likely ain't fucking. If you're not fucking, baby, you ain't having no sex.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Alenka Zupančič is a Slovenian philosopher whose work focuses on psychoanalysis and continental philosophy. She is the author of books such as What is Psychoanalysis, The Odd One In on Comedy, and What is Sex, which is a book we'll be discussing today. She's a member of what I think of as the Slovenian gang, along with Slavoj Žižek. She's a part of the Lacanian left. Alenka, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today and to join the chain of the speakers.
This is our second attempt to record a conversation. It's working much better now that I'm not at my kid's apartment, but here at home with a good internet connection. I want to actually start. I have a whole bit about Reggie Watts and his song, "If You're Fucking, You're Probably Fucking." But which I should saying that's at the start. I may get censored by YouTube, but we'll find out. But I don't want to start there. I want to actually start with Roger Scruton. Do you know who Roger Scruton was?
No, I'm not sure that I know.
He was a British philosopher. He was a conservative. He gave a lecture once entitled "Sexual Morality for Heathens." And during the lecture, he claimed that sexual desire is about an interpersonal reaction. He said that the aim of sex is not just bodily, but it is the aim is to connect to another. And it is, according to him, about creating personal and interpersonal meaning. Would you disagree with Scruton on that level, or is that too general of a statement to disagree with?
Yeah, I mean, one can certainly agree that it is the sex is never just about sex, that it is about many things, and that so if connecting with the other can be one of them for sure, but there are many other things that can be at play here, and this is what makes, I think, sexuality a worthy object of this kind of ontological investigation that I have taken in this book, because and this is what the title is meant to say. So what exactly is sex? What do we refer to when we say, okay, but this is sex, just like intercourse that can be physically described and circumscribed, some invisible substance, some meaning that is there. So I guess it's none of these things and many of them at the same time. So that one of my points is precisely that sex and sexuality exists precisely in this constant gap that separates it from itself, not simply from whatever. There is this kind of exists precisely as a kind of deviation, not from itself, and also what we call sublimations. I think are not really substitute satisfactions in the sense that we say, okay, instead of I don't know. Having sex, we write a poem or we have this conversation, but actually are kind of deviation of the sexual itself, which is not this kind of clear substance that we could circumscribe and say, okay, this now, here we can see it. This is, we can see, many things, but I don't think we can see the substance of the sex.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there are two levels that I want to explore in this conversation. One would be the philosophical level.
Yeah.
I think of answering the question, "What is sex?" is something akin to answering the question, "What is being?" Or it might be akin to answering the question, "What is it to know?" The epistemological question. So I think I'll go with the philosophical approach first. And in order to do that, I will start with that Reggie Watts song that I sent you before, entitled "If You're Effing, You're Effing." I've already broken the rule. And
so so that I know also what kind of words terminology to use.
No, you can say it. You can say fucking if you want. So here are a few lines from the song, and I'll just say it. The lines are: if you're fucking, then you're probably fucking. If you're fucking, then you're probably having some sex. If you're not fucking, then you're probably not fucking. If you're not fucking, then you definitely ain't fucking. If you're not fucking, then you most likely ain't fucking. If you're not fucking, baby, you ain't having no sex. However, in your book, What is Sex? You start by arguing that even if you are not fucking, and you said this just a moment ago, you might still be having some sex, or at least you might be enjoying the same satisfaction that you would if you were having sex. You write that even when you sublimate your sexual desire into non-sexual activities like baking a pie or having a conversation, you can still enjoy the same satisfaction you would derive from sex. You write, the point that Lacanian psychoanalysis makes, however, is more paradoxical. The activity is different, yet the satisfaction is exactly the same. In other words, the point is not to explain the satisfaction in talking by referring to its sexual origin. So I get the sense that sex is not just about biology, but is maybe something symbolic. Sex isn't just a straightforward physical act. It's a concept. But for me, the question remains, what sort of concept is it?
Thanks for this introduction, which I think really kind of puts us straight in the center of all these issues. Just a brief remark on your last, when you say that, you had the sense that sex is not just about biology, and it's also perhaps something symbolic. Actually, my claim is that it is a failure of both the symbolic and of biology. It's not simply symbolic instead of biological. It is also a kind of intrinsic failure of the symbolic itself. It's the very point when it comes into some kind of contradiction. But we can go into this perhaps later. First, I would like to respond to this obvious question that was there at the beginning of your argument, of your formulation, which is, so when I said, I'm not saying that there is simply no difference between different kind of activities, that whatever we do, we have sex. This is obviously not what I'm saying. I'm also not saying that it is having sex or fucking from the poem is just like, I don't know, having this conversation, for instance,
or baking a pie.
Or baking a pie or something like this. So, and so if I say that the satisfaction can be the same, this refers to something very precise, and I will simply try to describe what this is. We could say that it refers to something in fucking, in talking, in writing, in baking, that is more than just all these things like talking, fucking, writing, baking. And more, if I say more, I mean it in the sense that it is not exhausted, say, but by the functional dimension or usefulness of these activities. Like, I don't know, you say, okay, when I'm hungry, I have this need and I satisfy it by eating. But we know also from our everyday experience that when we eat, something else gets satisfied very often, not simply the need for food. And this something else could even become the strongest reason for us to eat, even if we are not hungry. So when I talk about the same kind of satisfaction, I'm precisely not talking about the satisfaction of the need, but of this, let's say, other surplus satisfaction, which kind of is also redoubling or is redoubled in what we call like having sex, or from the poem fucking. And I think this is a very important point to remember, that human sexuality is not sexual simply on account of it including sexual organs or something like this. Rather, there is something in the very constitution of human nature that I would say sexualizes the sexual activity itself, kind of endorses also with a surplus investment. So although I think perhaps this point could seem paradoxical, but if one thinks what it is that distinguishes, let's say, human sexuality from, say, animal or vegetal, at least as far as we can see, I think it is precisely the fact that human sexuality is sexualized, in this sense, that it is, we could say, sex is sexy. There is something else going on here. So this constitutive redoubling is what makes it kind of dislocated, not only in respect to, let's say, the reproductive purpose, but also in respect to itself, what we think is sex. So I think I could answer your question by saying sex refers to certain physical activity, but it also refers to something in any activity that is more than just this activity. And this more can be substituted for mores that occur in other activities. So perhaps this is one kind of simple but nevertheless way of putting it.
You have psychoanalytic training, right?
No, not really. No. I only have like the theoretical background, which it's where from a long date. I've been in analysis, but this is not relevant, I guess.
Okay, then I can tell you about this, and I won't have to worry that you're going to charge me. I have when you were describing this, a memory came to me. I started free associating, maybe, and I recalled when it was that I learned about sex, and and it was not when my parents took me aside and explained to me where babies come from. I was already informed about the mechanics of intercourse when I learned about sex, which came after. Okay, so like I knew what sex was, I knew what fucking was, right? But my neighbor, this neighbor boy who I was friends with, who was a little younger than I was, maybe a year younger, we were playing in the street. I don't remember exactly, what we were doing, but he kind of pulled me aside and said, I want to tell you something. Do you know that adults have sex even when they don't want to make a baby? And I was like, what? No, they don't. Why would they do that? Said, no, they like it. They like it. And I was like, what?
What is there to like?
Why would
obvious question?
Yeah, I was like, why would they like what? I thought this was how you make a baby, and that's what it was for. And he's like, they do it all the time. They're constantly doing it, and and that was like, a veil fell from my eyes, and I saw the world differently, and I was a little concerned, and that was a moment when I learned about sex, and I guess that was a moment when I learned about how sex is about something more than the act, more than
more than the act, and also it can be implied in some. I mean, it's obvious example, but there is also just a kind of inclination of the head or a smile that can be sexy without there being any intrinsic. This is what is interesting here. I think it's really. This kind of, on the one hand, the moment we try to provide a very clear definition of what is sexual activity, we get into trouble, because it is not simply given in advance, something that, as I said before, can be kind of isolated and described, assigned a place. This is the place of sex, and all the rest is something different. So it constantly operates. It is declination, and in relationship to all other things, which it kind of also can, this non-being contaminates them and kind of starts inhabiting them from within, words and stuff like this. But it also can sexualize things that at the first sight have nothing to do with sexuality, like violence and stuff like this. So it is very interesting how this works. Yeah.
Well, the relationship to pleasure seems important to me, but it's pleasure.
Yeah.
Even pleasure is in a Freudian context, pleasure means something different than what you normally would think of it as meaning, I guess. Because when I hear you talk about sex as something that can be applied in many different registers, and can the formal or abstract notion of sex arises, when you're baking a pie or having a conversation, I feel as though that abstract notion misses something, and it has to do with the physical act, right? It has to do with sex itself. But yet I also know that sex itself can be purely mechanical and not sexy, right? So it's a strange situation where I don't feel like we can really disentangle sex from, all sorts of sexual activity. But at the same time, I have to admit there is something that is separate that has to do with pleasure and excess.
Definitely. I mean, obviously, there is this question of pleasure or of enjoyment. I don't want to complicate too much. There is this kind of idea in the particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis that, pleasure is supposed to be, following Freud, some kind of a harmonious or kind of homeostatic principle, whereas enjoyment is something that is driven by more and more, not because it lacks something, but because it wants more of what it got.
Should we say Joysongs when we say enjoyment? Is that the
I mean, this is the French term, but basically it means that enjoyment can be, and very often it is beyond the pleasure principle, to use this Freudian description, which is to say that it doesn't necessarily stop when this homeostatic principle of when you, for instance, satisfy a need, you should be satisfied. That this is also a pleasure. When you satisfy a need, it is pleasurable experience because the frustration, let's say, disappears. But at the same time, this pleasure can start functioning as a causality of its own, as a kind of cause of further pleasure, or even the reason for further pleasure. So it is different than just, like, saying this pleasure in this non-conceptual way. But just I want to return to what you were saying before. It is not, for me, the question is not whether we can separate, let's say, the purely sexual thing from the sexual activity itself, and then see it in this abstract way also in other activities. No, I'm saying that it is already separated from the sexual activity in the very sexual act, in the sense that it is something more in this act that just is obviously related to pleasure. But there can be, for instance, I don't know, I just saw yesterday this beautiful Japanese movie that got the Silver Bear in Berlin. I think it's called Contingency and Imagination or something like this. There's this beautiful scene when a reading, of some pornographic scene, but nevertheless a simple reading by a woman of this passage to the author it functions like a sexual intercourse. It is an act. It is not simply, you say, okay, but they didn't do it. They did it in a way. I mean, and I think you have, so for me, this is not abstract if I say that there can be this kind of a surplus enjoyment in speaking, and this, for me, it's not something abstract, because words or writing, it's not abstract. It is a material practice that has this kind of a possibility of being involved in or contaminated. And this is, for me, so it's not that sexuality kind of makes these practices more dirty or more, I don't know, it is, I think it's the other way around. As I write in the book, for me, this kind of perspective shows how much this is not simply about debasing all these intellectual activities when we recognize a certain sexual dimension in them, as it is about also kind of rising the sexual activity itself in some kind of intellectual activity, not just some kind of basic instinct stuff. Because I really think that lots of, the ideas, the spirit comes in at some point, and it's not simply, about.
Well, you're a continental philosopher, right? Not an analytic philosopher. And like in the realm of analytic philosophy, A equals A. What you're looking for are systems of definitions and logical relations. And in the realm of continental philosophy, I feel like there's more of a space for poetic understanding, or and that's maybe not even the right word, but well, for Hegel, there's room for Hegel where understanding that A is also not A is vitally important for having an understanding of the world, the way in which contradictions and oppositions are built into what we take to be simple simple objects, say, like, my cup is also not a cup in order to be, right? And I feel like something similar is going on here with sex, that there's a way in which the act of sex is very much about the body and about pleasure and about genitals. I guess if we haven't regressed to an oral or anal stage or something, it's about genitals. In a Freudian perspective, that genital sex is the ultimate. But at the same time, it is not just those things. But if you try to like fill in that gap, whatever you come up with to explain what it is also about feels wrong. Like if you say, well, sex is also about your fantasies about what kind of person you want to be. So you're with a partner maybe who will satisfy your own narcissistic self-image, and so your fantasy about this partner is what you're acting out. That kind of sex misses what sex could be, and it's too close to like an analytic perspective where you have a clear fantasy, which I don't think we really do. So I'm not sure if I'm leading up to a question or not, but I'm just sort of trying to understand Joysongs and the way in which the lack of completeness, and the lack of harmony is essential to this notion of sex, and why that sex can be so essential to our understanding of the human, say.
There are many different questions here. The one that you started with, the question of the difference between continental and analytical philosophy, and this kind of, which is very well, I think, described precisely in this difference, the example that you gave between this kind of tautological A is A, a cup is a cup, and the kind of Hegelian, let's say, move here, which is not simply to say a cup is also perhaps not a cup. What Hegel does, the first move, is that he takes the tautology itself, A is A, and says, okay, but the very fact that we have one A in the place of the, how do you call it, the subject, and the other at the place of the predicate, already introduces the movement. They are not the same, actually. It is also, the moment you speak, you cannot simply say, you can say A is A, and this makes sense. But this means precisely that it makes sense on the basis of the possibility that A is not A, that they are not the same. So there is this kind of, even if you just say A, there is already this non-A implied in it. And here how then this Hegelian dialectics introduces this kind of movement in the tautology. And I kind of detected the same kind of subtle movement in tautology in these lines of the poem that you quoted at the beginning, where it's precisely, it is not simply saying fucking is fucking, it is also saying, but it is, trying to just to repeat this word so many times. And in this case, it is perhaps this, it is precisely about the movement at stake here. So it is not about this kind of sometimes boring, supposedly continental relativizing of everything, but things are also the opposite of what they are. No, it is, I think, for me, much more interesting and also much more materialistic notion of this gap or not coincidence being a way of the possibility of circumscribing precisely a certain contradiction of reality, obviously of the symbolic reality, because we have this way of talking about it that is symbolic and not simply kind of some kind of immediate communication with it. But so this is very, for me, very essential in understanding in general how kind of philosophy could work. So this is nothing directly yet to do with sexuality, but it's or sex. But it is true that I kind of approach this question of sexuality from the Freudian, let's say, standpoint, which is, I think, very, very interesting because for him, in Freud, sexuality becomes a concept, a kind of, I would say, even a philosophical concept. It's not simply a name of a certain act, let's say, copulation or something, but is a concept that names a certain network, also social network of contradictions, complications, meanings, impossibilities of meanings, and so on. This is what is sexuality. So if I say sexuality as a concept, it precisely means that it is something that helps us interrogate and perhaps kind of double question just this kind of everyday use of the term sex, which obviously also exists. But then if you stop to say what exactly, again, is the sex that we talk about all the time, then it becomes less clear what it is and how. So, and I think it is interesting to see this, not simply because it's so interesting to talk about sex, but because this is precisely this kind of ontological deficit or ontological negativity that is part of it, is also what relates it or what makes it absorb, bring in all the social dimension of the sexual, which is obviously extremely important. Sexuality and sex, it's not simply about intimacy. And the first thing that Freud discovered was, with his notion of sexuality, it made the intimacy explode. It was immediately all about the social relations and all kinds of things. So it's not to say that it is also about, it's not only body, it's also spirit, or it's not only the act, it's also pure pleasure. This also is constitutive of this once you start to think of it. It's not that you have some fundamental thing and then also other things, but that even this fundamental thing is already from within ridden by this negativity, but which in itself is the very locus and point where the pleasure gets generated. It's not, this is a kind of abstract formulation, but I would put it in this way, perhaps.
Well, I had a question that I had written and sent you before, which talked about Freud's understanding of our psychosexual development. I referred to
yeah, I remember.
Stage. Yeah, and while you were describing sex, and that's all we've been talking about, it came to me that I didn't want to ask it in this Freudian way. I wanted to ask it in a way that may be a little more accessible. Because the end of my question originally was, when we get to the genital stage or the genital phase of our psychosexual development, do we then know the truth about sex? But I think to flip this around, I might ask, was Freud trying to help people improve their sex life? And are you? Like, if you heard of Dr. Ruth Westheimer,
Do you say approve, or improve? I'm not sure.
Well, I don't know. There may have been a Freudian slip there. I may have said approve, but I meant to say improve. Make it better. You're not asking the question, what is sex, in order to then master sex so that you can have a better sex life, or advise other people on how to have a better sex life. But rather you're trying to give us an understanding into sex so that we can have a more self-conscious and self-directed life altogether, perhaps. And so my question would be, what do you think happens socially when we take up sex the way Dr. Ruth Westheimer does, as an aspect of our life which we can perfect, and that we are almost commanded to enjoy and maybe sanitize, or when sex becomes the same thing as eating 3 square meals a day and having a good communication and all of that.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of horrified by this approach, because I think it goes precisely against everything that Freud has discovered, and that I'm trying to kind of elaborate in this book, which, by the way, it's not about helping people improve their sexual experience. Is absolutely not about that. And if people would look for something like this in this book, I could say in advance that it would be very much disappointed. It is a kind of philosophical, ontological inquiry into what is sex, not only what is the meaning of sex, but what is the sex as related, obviously, also to meaning and so on. So I think what this kind of take on sexuality that presents it as one aspect. First of all, precisely, sexuality is not one aspect of our lives. It is kind of our lives are written by it in all kinds of ways. It is not that it could be, as I said before, circumscribed. Okay, now I will have some sex and I will try to make it the best possible. What Freud discovered, and I think this is important to bring into this conversation, is he discovered sexuality in relationship to the notion of the unconscious repression, which are not simply the notions that are meant to say that sex is being repressed all the time, and that Victorians are repressing it, that we should kind of freely admit it and encourage it. But he was really led very soon to see, Freud, that there was something in sexuality that is constitutively problematic, and not only problematic because of all the exterior prohibitions, regulations, because one of these ways of regulating what is problematic about sex, this negativity that seems to be there, whatever we do, is also to supposedly liberate it, to encourage it, to say, oh, this is nothing, sex is just a normal, a natural thing. No, precisely, it is not simply a normal, natural thing. It is a human thing, and as a human thing, it has something in itself which is far from simply nature following its course. So there is something, I think, terribly wrong with this kind of attempt to appropriate sexuality as just this kind of activity that we should that should be there because it's also good for our health, like gymnastics is, or whatever, jogging every day, and try to kind of separate it precisely from this edge, this negativity, which is both extremely productive and problematic. But it is there, and I don't think this can work. Then it just explodes. This is the repression of what sex is, if it just reduce it to this kind of activity. So I guess this sex can really, sexuality is the locus, the technology that can bring into our discussions and social behaviors, many things that are can be hidden otherwise, and it is important that it is that this happens, not that we just swept everything under the carpet. Supposedly, we've dealt with sexuality, but I also, when you sent me this question, referring to these different stages that Freud refers to, kind of the genital phase supposedly being the kind of the ultimate stage. I was thinking about this, and I wanted to reply to this. First of all, that this theory of stages, at least for me, it's not really what is interesting in Freudian concept of sexuality. It's obviously some kind of a tool that he uses, but he nevertheless, what is really important, I think, in Freud is his insistence on the notion of infantile sexuality. I think because this is, if we talk about the stages, now the oral, the anal, phallic, whatever, and then we have the mature sex. What I think Freud, and this was revolutionary, that Freud kind of insisted that there is such thing as infantile sexuality. But what does this mean? First, it meant for Freud that, yeah, it exists. Children are sexual beings. But also, secondary, it meant that it exists in the absence of both kind of biological and symbolic frameworks for its existence. So, both in the absence of natural and cultural parameters. This means that, like, biologically speaking, sexual organs of children are not up to their functions, if you just like take this function. Right. But also symbolically speaking, children have no means of understanding properly and making sense of what is happening to them sexually, when, I don't know, they're being seduced, or even if when they are touching each other, whatever. There is no symbolic framework for what is happening. So one can understand why this infantile sexuality is such a kind of sensitive and explosive zone to think about, and rightly so. But I think what is really scandalous, what was scandalous about the Freudian theory was not this kind of developing stages, but another point, which would be that if sexuality, infantile sexuality, is something that is covered neither by biology nor by the symbolic or the culture, the point is that actually this doesn't change all that much when we become adults. I think this was the real scandal. Namely, that this kind of maturity of sexual organs dramatically fails to make these organs function as exclusive sites of sexuality. This is part of it, but it's not like it doesn't then just happen there and remain there and only there. And it also fails to produce a kind of solid basis for clearly framing, symbolically understanding what is our sexuality. Why? So it is, I think, the reason why infantile sexuality is so sensible, is considered to be such a dangerous and sensitive zone. It's not simply because of its difference, in contrast with adult sexuality, but rather because of their proximity, that actually as adults, we are not so much better off. Obviously, we have parameters of understanding something, negotiating things, and making the part of it, but it's not, and I think this is something very important that is there in Freud, much more so, I would say, that this question, what this ultimate genital phase, certainly exists, but it fails also in some ways. So it's not.
Well, again, I'm having a memory, and this was even more dangerous one. But when I was about 6 or so, 7, I recall I had a neighbor girlfriend. We played doctor a few times. You know,
I think
right?
all the children do this. Yeah.
Right. So I was like, you know, it's like, I'll be the doctor and I'll examine you, and then you can be the doctor and you can examine me. And it was quite a mystery what was going on when we did that. And we got caught. It was embarrassing. We got caught by the her father, who was a military man, he caught me. But anyhow,
this could lead to certain sexual fetishes later in life.
Right, later in life, yeah. But later on, I don't play doctor anymore, right? But maybe I play some other game when I get the neighbor lady alone, and so that need for a fantasy structure is what persists from childhood to adulthood. I mean, in childhood, it's pretty easy to see, like, the only context we had or excuse that we could come up with in order to explore each other would be, oh, we're at the doctor, or I have to pee, or something, something like that. But later on, you don't need that excuse. You've already been informed by the boy down the road that adults have sex just for the hell of it. so you start to understand that. But nonetheless, that need for a fantasy persists. And is that something that's key to understanding how sex is kind of a universal part of the human experience, the need for an imaginary or fantasy structure for our lives to provide us a way to enjoy, and also the fact that those fantasies can exceed their functionality, that they're not practical. Ultimately, they take on a power of their own. Is that part of what you're driving at?
Absolutely. I think this is really what I'm trying to say in a nutshell, because it means that actually this necessity of sexual fantasies is there also at the most basic level, let's say, of sexual activity. So it is not simply something added to it, but it is actually what makes sexual activity possible. It is never immediate. I think this is not only about fantasies in the sense of, okay, you have I don't know, sex, and you think about these other persons or ways of doing it or whatever. Not only this sense, but it could also be, let's say, if you find a certain gesture, a certain position of your partner sexually appealing, this could also already be a part of fantasy. It is already mediated. It comes from some certain kind of symbolic experience, can be memory, something which has gone through the wheels of this kind of non-physical existence, non-bodily existence, but nevertheless as a bodily experience. So this is absolutely crucial, as you say, that actually there is no sex in this sense without sexual fantasy making it possible, in a kind of giving us access to this act, or to enjoyment in this act. So in a way, and in this sense, it is never immediate, even when it is immediate in the sense that it corresponds to what we would roughly say, okay, this is clearly a sexual intercourse. But so it's not simply, if we say it's not only that, as I said earlier, I'm not simply saying, okay, it is so much more than this. It is simply that it never simply coincides with itself. There is this gap, this space, which is usually filled or occupied by this kind of fantasies, and which then obviously bring in all the can be the social sphere, the sphere of our other experiences and memories and so on. And it is a kind of framework. It's not that we need to actively then think of these things. It could be a small detail that kind of brings in and functions as this kind of filter that makes it possible for us to actually sexually relate to another person.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about sex for a while now. I want to raise another topic, which is love. And how do you think about your understanding of sex as a philosophical concept, as opposed to Zizek's notion of love? He describes in his book, the Sex and the Absolute, I think is the name of the book, how the possibility for real material sex without a fantastical or without a fantasy supporting it, would be what he thinks of as an act of love. That love would get beyond sex.
The fantasy.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
No, I mean, I think we kind of, with Slava, we are here thinking along the more or less the same lines, because, okay, the title, I think, is Sex and the Failed Absolute. So it's kind of a failure of the absolute, which doesn't simply mean that it's always a failure and there is no absolute. It means in a way precisely that this failure itself could start functioning as the absolute. And I think this is precisely what he means by love, as something that is actually capable of relating to the other also in a sexual way, but going, I would say, okay, this is a kind of tricky vocabulary, beyond fantasy, as a kind of bringing in or leaning or on something else than fantasy, or constituting something else as fantasy to mediate this space between the two. And I think this, I would basically agree that this is what love is all about. I would simply add, and this is perhaps, I'm not even sure if it is a kind of small difference that we share with Slava. I also, differently from many readings and also from a huge canyon of Western literary work, I think that love has much more to do with comedy than with tragedy. And not in the sense that obviously there is such thing as tragic love, or love kind of tears us open and exposes us to the world in an unprecedented way. So in this sense, we are up for some tragedies if we are in love. It could be, but love that works, let me put it like this, when is this kind of for me, I think Lacan also has this line at some point, it is a kind of comic movement, in the sense precisely not simply something funny, but a certain pas de deux, a certain dialectics of in which the very missed encounter keeps feeding the possibility of the encounter itself. So this failure could also be taken perhaps in this sense of a comic failure, which is very different from the tragic failure, because tragic failure kind of pushes us off the cliff, so to say, whereas kind of comic failure works almost the other way around. It produces its own surplus. It kind of bounces us back into something else. So comic failure, usually it's not just about not succeeding to doing something, but also about surplus succeeding, about particularly something succeeding there when we where we least expect it to succeed. And I think there is something in the dialectic of love, which for me is quite fascinating, because it does involve, in this sense, for me, this element of surprise. You're surprised, you cannot but be surprised that this actually works like this, and that this is happening. So for me, surprise is one of the effects that are clearly kind of relevant for the discussion of love, because and it's not, okay, I knew all along this person was meant for me. It is precisely, even if I knew it all along, or even if I am looking for love, I don't know, somewhere online, when it really happens, I claim you are still surprised. There is something that happens there that you don't, even if you were looking for it, it comes from a slightly different angle, and it kind of throws you out of your joint, so to say, also by means of something that to which then you have to react in a certain way. And this is where what I call the comedy of love, as this kind of being together starts, when you then have to respond always to things which are not simply following this kind of linear causality, but these other moments that pop up or keep popping back, and that one needs to intercept in the air and play with further. But yeah, I definitely think, but I also think that love and sexuality are obviously related. I'm not, so it's not that we can say, okay, this is just sex and this is love. There is, perhaps I could put it this way, there is sex without love, but I'm almost sure there is no love without sex in one of these many meanings, but still.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't help but, recall the fact that the song that I referenced at the start is comedic. It's a joke.
Mhm.
It's a
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Reggie
yeah.
Watts,
Obvious. Yeah, yeah,
right? And Reggie Watts
yeah.
is a very hilarious comedian, and he's lovely. You watch him and you feel better. He's fun. He's not a dark comic. He's very light, really. And so I think that all ties together. I want to ask you a couple more questions, even though that would be a good place to stop. But about the politics of this briefly, because you mentioned in your book that in psychoanalysis, sex is disappearing, which is the last place you'd expect it to disappear from, is in psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
But it's also disappearing from Hollywood films. And it's even as we become more and more pornographic society with easy access to hardcore imagery and all of that online, sex is disappearing from our culture. It seems like at the same time we don't have a sense of it. It's more taboo. Sex is more taboo or dangerous seeming now than it was 20, 30 years ago, it seems to me. What do you think is the explanation for the disappearance of sex from psychoanalysis and from our culture?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have some kind of overwhelming general answer to this, but I think it is definitely true what you say, that in spite of, or even all through this kind of pornographization of many things, on the one hand, and through this other movement that you described earlier, this kind of commodification of sexuality, selling it as just another aspect which we can improve, and then take to a kind of something that can enrich our lives and so on. All these things are obviously avoiding something quite essential about sexuality, a certain edge that it has, and which is, at least this is my take on it. It is not simply, for instance, sometimes we have this idea that what is being kind of covered here, also when there is censorship or whatever, what is covered over by these procedures, that this is some kind of a dirty, subversive substance of sexuality. But I think what Freud actually was the first to articulate clearly is that what is being covered there, it's not some dirty, subversive substance of sexuality, but the fact that sexuality is itself a problem rather than the ultimate answer to all our problems. I mean, this is a common misunderstanding that for Freud, sexuality is the ultimate answer. No, it is the ultimate question. It is the problem. This is what he saw very clearly. So there is nothing obvious or self-evident about it, and it carries in itself this kind of inherent impasse, and also an impasse, I would say, or contradiction or antagonism of that to what it pertains, or what it is part of, that is to say, symbolic, social, whatever structure. So the scandal of sexuality, I think, is not something that we can see in it, but precisely something that cannot be seen because it is not there. When I see, I don't know, naked bodies or an act of copulation, we see many things, but we don't see, for instance, what Lacan called the sexual relation, which is why he said there is no sexual relation. So relations certainly exist, and they can be very sexual, but they exist against the background of not having any this kind of pre-given automatic key. So sexual relations then exist as comedy, tragedy, or so on, but they also have this social dimension because of this this need for social regulation. But again, my claim would be that what this regulation is trying to regulate is precisely not something which is there, but something which is not there, and which we try to kind of obsessively fill in or make this think and negativity invisible or something like this. So I guess this is, for me, what is interesting. So we should not go too quickly for this, okay, sex is becoming, why is it problematic? Not simply because certain images are, they can be, but certain images are disturbing. But what this disturbance further suggests about ourselves, about our being, about our non-being, this is, I think, what is really considered and has always been considered this kind of a neurological difficult point of sexuality that we are now trying absolutely to get rid of.
Yeah.
Sex, but the what in sex is precisely more or less than sex. This is being now subject of all these kind of censorships, which sometimes take place, as I said, or take the form of encouragement of. This is also a way of not dealing with what is sex.
Yeah. Eric Fromm wrote a book called Escape from Freedom, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like maybe that's connected to this current attempt to escape from sex. That freedom is a problem, really.
Yeah.
And so my Google is talking to me. I must have said something to it.
Escape from freedom. You mentioned escape from freedom.
Right, and the Google's like, I can help you with that. Yeah. So, and I'm also struck by the fact that I have kids who are Zoomers, and they explain things to me. And one of the things that has been explained to me lately is that your gender has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. And there's been a huge focus on changing genders in the last 10 years or so. People they don't want to just be trans from going from male to female or female to male, but they want to go from male to, I don't know, lamp genders, one that actually exists, or, or gender fluid, or what, just a whole hundreds of different kinds of genders. Chicken tender gender. It's a joke gender, but that also exists. And but the key to it is that changing your gender is this radical act that people are interested in, whereas what your sexual orientation is of almost no interest to anyone at all anymore. It's like being gay is not subversive anymore. Like everyone is gay, no matter what they want to do sexually, because there's no foundation for that orientation. There's no, you're just oriented in whichever way. And I'm not sure exactly what I'm getting at, except that it seems to me that this is somehow connected to both an attempt to be free, but also an attempt to be free in a way that has very little risk to it, where you can be, you escape from the problem of freedom.
I think I basically, if I got what you were saying, I very much agree with you, because I think that there is one thing which already John Cobject pointed out is this, what happened when even the talk about sexual difference completely disappeared and it was replaced by the terminologically by the talk about the gender differences. What disappeared in this move from sex to gender is precisely sex, and not sex only in the sense of gender, like male, female, or whatever, but precisely in the sense of sex being an ontological impasse, a problem. The problem disappeared already, or was trying to. So it's then, and in what you describe, I think at least this is for me. Obviously, people are free to do what. it's interesting. And even here we would say people are free. They are not. I mean, if you take this seriously, then I don't think this is simply the question of a freedom of choice. If you can simply choose one of the genders, then I don't think this. I mean, there is a certain necessity, a certain pain, not in the sense of punishment, but a certain existential thing related to it. For me, sexual orientation, to put it this way, the terms that you used, is a kind of subjectivation of the very impulse of the sexual. This impulse exists for everybody, and we subjectivate it in very different ways, which are for this very reason sexual, not before and not simply gender, because we subjectivize a certain sexual impulse, inconsistency, negativity that is there in sexuality as such. So, but if you just then replace this and say, okay, we can choose between like going to the, and this is caricature, I don't think people usually discuss this in this way, that we can go like in supermarket and then decide what today will be this kind of playful, okay, this can be a game, a social game, even a sexual game, but I don't think it has the weight even of this what we are discussing when we are discussing precisely of also possible sexual retention, sexuality, and also of subjective necessity that is part of this, which is not simply we are a subject, we are not simply free to choose what it is. Our freedom comes as precisely based on this or that necessity. I don't think the question of freedom and of free choice for me are two very distinct questions. And freedom is much more fundamental and much more important than just the freedom of choice, which kind of obfuscates and produces this image that we are this kind of supposedly completely neutral, uncurved, unwritten beings, then just can construct themselves in whatever way they want if they're free to do. But I think the Freudian lesson is very much, no, you can do whatever, you try to construct yourself in 100 different ways. The problem will not disappear because of this. So this is not to say you have to suffer whatever gender you are ascribed. No, I'm not saying this. You can change it, but it's usually because you really feel the urge to do it, not because you just want to play a little bit around and to try other things. So, I think. And so,
listen, we've already talked for an hour. I feel like I could talk to you for another hour easily. But we'll leave it here for now. But I'll ask you this: would you like to come back and talk about comedy sometime? Because you've written a book about comedy.
Yeah, I have done this. Yeah, this is my ultimate crime. No, of course, with pleasure.
If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and click that bell. You should also consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons get access to a second behind-the-scenes parrot room discussion where we dish out gossip or go into the weeds on topics such as the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, imperialism, and the critical theories of Tiffany Brissett and Donald Most. You'll also get access to both the public and private version of the revised Pop the Left series with Ashley Frawley and Pascal Robert, and the new Zoomer Philosophy series. Your support will not only make content like this possible, it will also help to establish a new publishing venture through Diet Soap Media. Right now, supporting me on Patreon will make a big difference.